Okay. Okay, we're ready for countdown.
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Pull to Refresh podcast. We began having these conversations with the goal of forming our XPRIZE team, and we continue to explore ideas that may become the most impactful sustainability solutions. I'm Christian Robinson. This episode features a recording of our Clubhouse room with special guest and fellow XPRIZE contender, Daniel Walmsley. Daniel was interviewed by our CEO, Arin Crumley.
So the reason we invited you here, Dan, isn't just for all time's sake, okay? But that is part of it. No, the reason was because I was listening the other day to the XPRIZE teams share their projects in a little team recruiting session that XPRIZE had organized. And I was just, working on some electronics, letting that play over off my computer off to the side. And then I heard that just really recognizable Australian accent. I'm like, I know that voice. What the heck? And then I came over to the computer and sure enough, it was you. Now, not only that, but I also thought that what you were talking about was super duper cool. And it's just something that we are kind of already enthusiastic and excited about, messing around with Raspberry Pis every single day over here as well. So my first question is to, just open it up to you. Can you share with everybody what it is that you're working on with your XPRIZE team and how this kind of could grow from something small into something potentially really impactful and big?
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for inviting me on. It's really exciting to be talking about this, and it's also a little daunting because I don't feel like I've done very much other than talk about it. I'm really at the beginning of sort of the implementation phase. So, in some ways I think by talking, so it's a good opportunity for me to think as well. So how did I come to this? Basically the idea, I'll describe the idea first because the story of how I came to the idea is extremely long and complicated. But more or less, I had a very similar idea, I think, to what Pull to Refresh is doing of, I saw a graph. It was basically here's how many years we have to reduce our emissions to zero if we want to avoid 2.5 degrees of warming, right? And I think everyone's kind of familiar with that. And it's basically crunching down to zero. Literally the only thing to avoid catastrophic levels of warming or the risk thereof is creating sources of negative emissions, i.e. carbon capture. And I think that's, probably the same story for everyone here, more or less. We all have a moment like that. It's oh, wow, I just put solar cells and batteries all over my house, but actually it's not going to affect the climate for 30 years because it's all about the CO2 that's already in the sky. And so, I was aware that, I was looking into different forms of carbon capture. I wasn't aware of the XPRIZE yet. But basically, I found that algae was the fastest biomass producer. And I've got friends who are sort of farmers who are telling me all the different ways they sequester carbon in soil or in lakes or in whatever. And that there's an economy around this as well that's kind of growing. And so I thought, well, I wonder if there's a way I can just do that for myself. I just want to grow algae for myself and see what happens. And as I was doing it and as I was doing the napkin math, I thought, wow, if you really wanted to do this at a planetary scale, what you need is to do it in the oceans. And you need to do it with a billion robots out there with big tanks kind of sequester growing algae as fast as you can in the oceans and then kind of pushing it down to the ocean floor of below 100 meters where it's effectively sequestered for 100 years. And so basically your idea is the bigger version of my idea, right? And then I thought, I'm kind of pretty time poor, like a lot of parents of young children. What's the bit I can focus on where I really feel I can make a dent in the problem? And I have a lot of experience with meteorological data processing and building sensing devices. I did the systems integration for Incheon Runway 3, which is the busiest runway in the world. I did, this is all sort of back in the day, 20 years ago, but built the firmware for the machines and the server that processes the data and all the redundancy and all the whatever. And, built systems for the Bahrain Air Force and a few others, just, so sensor integration and prediction and all of the integrations there. And I thought I think I can do that bit. I can do a device that reads the CO2 level of like some atmosphere and some water and like various other important metrics like turbidity and pH and whatever, and uses that to build a model of what's happening in a body of water and like how well it's actually growing algae in some cases, and therefore you can sort of do fleet learning and kind of optimize that growth over time. That's the basic idea.
Okay, great. Now, so what I got the sense though, which is kind of funny since Andrew's cracking the jokes about WordPress, is that there's this type of thinking of like, can it be a kit? Can it be sort of a homebrewed, grow your own? Is that where your mind goes?
Yeah, well, I think as a first pass, I think, I'm from the open source world, so I'm very much about like keeping a developer diary and doing things in the open. And so I was sort of like, how can I bring people along? How can I build a community of like-minded people? And I thought, well, yeah, if I do like a blog and then eventually I release a kit and then eventually maybe there's an assembled version of the kit, like, we can sort of tinker together and do it in a sort of asynchronous open source way using RP2040 and, various other bits of open source kit that people are familiar with. So yeah, I love the idea of giving, people like me, really is scratching my own itch. I wanted a thing I could build with my kids to say, oh, look, climate change has a cause and it has a solution, right? It's the same reason I got an electric car. It's the same reason. All these other things, which I can do because I have a high-paying tech job, right? Not everyone can afford to do that, but maybe everyone can afford, $100 or something to sequester carbon in their backyard. And if the carbon economy works out the way that it maybe will or should, then money will pour into that economy to reward people for capturing carbon. And maybe that can be something that it's just like you mine Bitcoin right now. Maybe if you can verify that someone's captured a certain amount of carbon, then maybe that little kit can start to make them money.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Okay, so do you have a pool in your backyard?
No, but I have 3 55-gallon food-grade plastic drums.
Okay, so because when you were talking before, I imagined like kind of like a skateboarder going into a bowl of a emptied out pool. So you're even thinking on the 55-gallon drum scale.
Yes, because I want it to be accessible. So it needs to scale down to something people can do, like something the size of a homebrew beer kit, right? But it also needs to be able to scale up to like larger and larger volumes. And so, in my imagining, right, it's got some amount of locomotion and it also has a sonar. So, in a large body of water, even a lake, these things could space themselves out, within the volume of the lake, and use sonar to estimate the total volume and then use various other probes to detect like the state of the ecosystem in that lake, and then what might need to be done to foster the growth of algae.
Right. Okay. So now, how necessary is it to be in your mind in a body of water? If this could be something people do at home with their kids or at a school, they could try this.
Yeah, because a 55-gallon drum of algae sequesters as much carbon as an acre of forest. So like, there's just there's no comparison to other forms of like biomass-based sequestration. Like, the easiest medium to grow it in is water because, you can just rely on basic photosynthesis and like smash up some like basalt and throw it in the top and bubble the air through and you're good to go. Like, it's not that simple, right? Like, I'm sure like scientists are slapping their heads right now being like, it's not that simple. But, that's the starting point though. And the really, really important thing I think that I want to convey, is my specific perspective on this is that the most important thing is the scaling properties of the system, like not its initial efficiency, not its underlying, like not, the throughput of a given like gallon of like tank of water or whatever, but like what are the scaling properties? Like how fast can it scale? How quickly can it be deployed? How accessible is it as a way of sequestering carbon? And so, if a dollar is looking for somewhere to go, right, to solve this problem, it's drawn to the mechanism of highest capital efficiency. And so that would be like sort of the premise. And so that's why I'm applying, they say turn everything into a problem you've solved before, right? So the problem I solved before is, scaling stuff in the cloud and doing, fleet learning and large scale sort of data aggregation and processing. And so like, and I guess it's not that different from, say, the FSD model, right? Where it's like you figure out what hardware you need to deploy and you put it in the field, and then you sort of iterate on the sort of algorithms behind that, and you sort of work through the owner operator of this system to kind of create the right conditions to maximize growth. I don't know if I answered your question. It's my second beer. So
you're talking, like the full self-driving by Tesla, and how they were able to let the owners operators be, in a way, test subjects for a system that they themselves wanted to get better. Like both Tesla and the driver want it to improve. So are you imagining people would participate in a project that ultimately aggregated this data back all to a kind of, I don't know, maybe co-machine learning could be a term, where you spread the problem out to a whole bunch of devices that might have different local variables, but that ultimately push everything back to increase the overall wisdom?
Yeah. I mean, that's not co-machine learning. That's just machine learning. That's like we're taking sensor data, we're recording it in the cloud, and then we're saying like, okay, here's all the sort of independent variables, and now here's the thing we want to predict, right? We've done this plenty on the web, right? So it's like you take a given website and you have this huge, data set of websites and the ways that they've changed over time and what kind of traffic or commerce or whatever they've attracted to themselves as a result of, upgrading their theme or changing a plugin version or switching hosts, right? And based on that data, you can then generate a set of recommendations for any website, to say, here's the steps you take to become more to be more successful, because we've compared you with similar websites and here's what they did. So given your conditions, here's what you need to be more successful. Here's what you need to be more similar. Like, you can think of them as vectors in space, or in the machine learning sense, they're called embeddings. So an embedding is a semantic representation of an object in vector space. It might be a 12-dimensional vector that might represent a word or a mood or a whatever, and so in this particular case, it represents like the state of your system. Now, some of those vectors are going to have higher efficiency and some are going to have lower efficiency. So you find the nearby ones that have higher efficiency and try to move the person in that direction. And that essentially boils down to a list of steps or recommendations. Change the temperature to this or whatever.
More bubbling,
Right, more bubbling, right? And then the machine can do some of it by itself, but some of it's going to rely on hobbyists. And ultimately you make the machine more capable. You provide extra services that can deliver resources to people's homes, before they're necessary and stuff, and you make the machine more and more efficient. But the starting point is, you've got a thing that can bubble and emit light and sense various environmental properties, and it sends them over the internet in some raw form to a server. And everything else after that is you communicating with the customer to say, based on what we've learned, here's what you need to do.
You said customer.
Right. Someone who owns the device, right? Yeah.
Okay, there's so many interesting directions we could take this conversation. First, let me just comment wow, the interdisciplinary nature of the XPRIZE is pretty amazing. The way that you just talk about all of this machine learning experience and systems architecture and experience and apply it to the climate crisis and bridge that gap and okay, how could we take a solved problem and apply it to an unsolved problem is fascinating. So you tell me, do you want to talk more? It's choose your own adventure. Do you want to go more into how this might work business-wise, or do you want to go more into how this might work in terms of the biology? Because I know I brought up interdisciplinary, as a concept, because obviously we're a lot of media makers and tech people and marketers, and we don't necessarily all have biology degrees, right. And yet we are going to if we're going to do any of the stuff we're talking about, we're going to need to master biology.
Yes. That is the thing I know the least about, and yet it is by far the most important aspect of this system. And, I am using this system to learn biology, and what I might learn might tell me that this is not going to scale. And I'm completely open to that. To be honest, part of the reason that I'm doing this is I've got a few nights free a week and I wanted a hobby rather than sitting there on Netflix and just worrying about the world or trying not to look at the news, So I see that as a problem that can be solved over time. What I'm looking for is a sort of a harness in which this system can iterate and grow using network effects and network economics that are drawn from the online world. And I sort of naively assume that the biology is a solvable problem. That said, like, I've spoken to makers of lab equipment, that I've tried to purchase for the purposes of like doing better modeling, right? And that lab equipment is outrageously expensive because it's designed to work under unbelievably tightly controlled conditions, right? So you have a $350,000 machine that has like 32 different like tiny petri dishes in it, right? And it's like carefully controlling the environment of each of those dishes, and each one of them has like a microscope on it and shit like that. I can't afford that kind of thing. And so I'm working very coarse grained. And so, my signal to noise requires lots and lots of data.
Right. So that introduces the concept of sensors. I mean, because it has happened before that biology has been, we've seen progress in healthcare, leveraging machine learning, in which the people who worked on it knew nothing about, let's say, identifying tumors and X-rays. But the reason this was made possible was through incredible sensory input of the actual imaging itself, and then also the human tagging and things like that. So how do you imagine tackling like what we can get from like a hooked up to an Arduino a temperature sensor, or maybe a microscope and an image to see like what kinds of things are floating nearby a $5 camera sensor, or how do we shrink these systems down to sensors that could get enough meaningful data?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, and I can't speak again to like the specific sensors that a biologist would recommend, blah blah blah. But like broadly speaking, if you're trying to make like you want the fewest sensors possible and the cheapest sensors possible, right? Ideally 0 sensors, but probably at least 1. And the question is like, is that sensor, it doesn't have to sense everything. It just has to sense like proxy values that have strong signal in them, right? So if you want to figure out how much carbon has been like stored in a given body of water, like you could, extract the carbon, dry it out and weigh it, right? But you might find that the opacity of the water is a pretty good proxy for the mass of sequestered CO2. Right. So opacity, well, that's easy, right? Like you have a light sensor and you have a beam, or whatever it is you need to do. We used to do that all the time in aerospace. It's like we had fog sensors that were just like a laser across the runway, and you sort of measure forward and back scatter. There's going to be some experimentation and trial and error. And you also, like, again, from the tech world, you kind of want like regression tests. So like where you see anomalies in the data, or where you see interesting patterns in the data, or what looks like failures, you want to try and like reproduce the conditions as closely as possible. So it might be that you have test rigs that are measuring really, really large amounts of data and are quite expensive. And they are mapping that back onto the sensor data from the devices and trying to extrapolate what the initial conditions were and reproduce them, so that you can find that corner case or find that super case and like make optimizations. And that kind of mapping is the sort of thing that could be done if you were careful, like using machine learning. But I think there's no substitute as well for expertise, and I don't want to downplay that at all. I think there's definitely a role for that. I do find though that expertise is sometimes, it's dangerous to focus too much on the biology part, because if you think about this from an academic point of view and not a consumer product technology point of view, then you might end up optimizing something for throughput that can't scale. So it's a balance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's much more intuitive to think about the way that you're describing it. I mean, to me, I feel that is more intuitive. I think, of course, there's other people who would disagree and who would find it more intuitive to lean into, let's say they have marine biology experience or, other backgrounds. So what's the scenario in which you imagine it becoming can you get more into that? Like, what would the wrong approach be? I mean, how would it go wrong by actually designing it totally around, let's say you just got really into the biology and said, okay, these nutrients are needed. And so we're just going to provide them, we're going to, I mean, because you mentioned analyzing the dry weight. Like, what's wrong with just looking at what the microalgae ends up being and providing what it would need to become that, just per measurement, and then observing algae since it comes from at some point in the wild. I'm here on a lake, and I see all kinds of microalgae floating around in there, as well as seagrass and things. So it's all over the place, and I've witnessed interesting things like bubbles coming up during hotter parts of the day. You know, why not just use the Earth as our lab, collect observational data, really go the science route, and then ask the question, okay, now let's make an automated system here.
So you're saying like, don't worry about like too much measurement. Just say, I've got a lake this size and I can kind of extrapolate how much algae it sequesters in a year. And like, I'm just going to sell the credits for that.
Well, I mean, okay, so that goes to a whole potential proposed business plan. I wasn't going there in my mind. What I'm actually thinking is like this approach this fascinating approach that you're talking about, in which information is gleaned through the data. Right. So this data-driven approach to solving the problem and saying, well, we can be wrong. We tune the signals. We eventually become a little bit more right. And the thing can create a feedback loop to where eventually it steers itself and it's driving down the road, you know. But the equivalent of that in cultivating microalgae, like why take a data-driven approach of basically pawing around in the dark, trying to grab a hold of the right path, when the scientific, I'm just trying to give like the counterpoint, when the scientific approach would be to actually read a bunch of literature, figure out exactly all the different types of algae, figure out the one that can grow, figure out exactly what it needs, then just provide it those conditions. And then if it needs a little tuning, tune it a little left or right as is needed.
Sure. I think you need to do those in parallel. I don't think you can block the hardware on the research. Like, because there's things that we already know the hardware needs to have, right? Like we already know that it needs firmware and a cloud server and a CO2 sensor and, you know, there's certain power requirements. It needs to be able to run certain kinds of motors and it needs to have certain unit economics and like all these other things. And so like, you know, I think in parallel to that, there needs to be conversations with scientists about like, what's theoretically possible or necessary, or, you know, what kind of modeling is out there. But you need to have both, so that they can be cross-correlated. Because at the end of the day, you know, stuff that happens in the lab is not the same as stuff that happens in the real world. You need to have both in order to know the difference. And I've done work in labs, right? And I've also built factories. And so I know the difference between like research and production and the ways that those interrelate. But I'm focused on the parts of the problem that I can sort of do that are sort of unblocked right now, and I'm making progress there, whilst at the same time having, you know, I mean, I've had conversations going back now like a year and a half with a friend of mine who's a marine biologist, about, you know, the chemistry of the ocean and, you know, different people he knows who are making like ocean going robots and all these other amazing things, and what we can do, sort of change the world's like biochemistry. You know, I'm just interested in what I can do starting from zero. And as long as it like doubles every month, like I can start from zero and have the worst system in the world. And as long as the properties of it are such that it improves, you know, better than linearly, then everything else will be achievable in time.
This technology way of this technology, well, how do I say this? This approach to tackling problems that mimics the approach that technology problems are tackled is very refreshing to hear. So it's very cool.
Well, you know, there's all these people doing pictures of like, well, we just need to build a mile-high tower made out of titanium in every continent, you know, and power it by a nuclear reactor, and then we could do X or Y. And it's like, good luck permitting that, right? Like, I just don't see how, you know, you can prove that that's the right approach in time. Because if it turns out to be the wrong approach and you've spent $7 trillion building mile-high titanium towers in the sky, like, you're fucked, right? You can't get that time back. Like, so you basically have to sort of start proving things out now. And we need much more of an evolutionary approach than a sort of like ivory tower sort of like approach. Or at least we need both, right? One is a hedge against the other. In the end, these like massive infrastructure projects are essentially going to become a political minefield where you're going to have complete regulatory capture by existing, like, say oil producers and things like that who are like, hey, let us help you with that problem. We build oil rigs and shit. Like, get us to build these like giant towers of machinery that are going to like scrub the air of CO2. And I don't think we should leave it up to those people to solve the problem. And for multiple reasons, but not least of which, I don't think we have time to find out that they're wrong.
Well, I don't think they really want to anyways. I mean, who wants to sign up for high risk, most likely not going to work kind of total time sinks? Who wants to sign up? But you know what? The answer to that is all of us XPRIZE teams. We sign up.
Yeah.
So,
honestly,
which is pretty amazing.
I'm just glad to be part of the conversation. Like, this could come to nothing, and it's already been so fun. I spoke for 10 minutes this week, one time, and suddenly I'm on this call with you. And I'm like, oh, this is what I was looking for. This is this is where the energy is right now. And I'm so excited to hear all these people pitching their ideas. And I'm so excited about what we're all going to learn trying to put them into action. I was talking to a guy today who called me out of the blue earlier this week, just totally unrelated to this. And he's working on sort of more the movement building side of climate change and carbon capture and how we sort of get people interested in doing something. And there's so many different efforts like that I think are all going to plug together at some point. And we, being part of this community gives me so much optimism that I didn't have before because everyone's coming out of the woodwork right now. There is a hand raised, by the way. I don't know who that is.
Well, we just accepted Dylan Toll. So, okay, so this is a good transition then to pass it over to different guests on the stage who've jumped up. We've got Eli. Did you have a comment, Eli? It's good to see you as always here on Clubhouse. How are you doing? Also, Eli has his own XPRIZE team as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I actually finally just officially registered a Teraton plus. Though.
Congratulations. So then you must have submitted to Ocean Visions.
Exactly.
Congratulations, Eli.
Exactly. Thank you. So unfortunately, their web form doesn't let you put pluses in, so it's like plus spelled out. It's really awful. 1 plus or 2 pluses? 2 pluses.
Oh, you had to spell out 2 pluses. That's painful. Oh.
But it's an analogy to the C compiler, which is self-hosting, makes more of itself. So
well, and by the way, Eli and Dan. What a meeting of minds here.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping we could keep those two guys apart.
Yeah.
So, Eli, you must have some questions or comments for Dan.
So, what organisms have you been working with out of curiosity? Which are your favorite?
I'm just starting with Chlorella vulgaris.
Good choice.
Common, well understood. I'm honestly looking to just grow anything. It's like literally in the mail right now. Like, this is so like V0. It's like V-1. Like the algae is in the mail and I've got like the hardware and I'm like flashing the processor and I'm getting it to send sensor data to like the cloud, but like nothing's actually all connected together yet. So, it might land with a friggin' thud. Who knows?
Well, we're just wasting your time right now. You should actually just be coding that thing instead of talking to us.
I was until 1 minute before the call, and I will begin coding again 1 minute after the call.
We're literally wasting your time. What are we doing?
No, you're inspiring
me. Okay, let's try to make this productive, though.
So
okay.
I mean, chlorella is a good choice, not only because it's a fast grower, but and well studied, but also because it's food grade. There are some interesting organisms, but they make various nasty toxins, and that's something that you would not like to do at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I literally just was like Googling things and seeing how many like hits they had. And I was just like picking a form of algae that more people were talking about. Like, I'm so unscientific. But again, it's just about starting, right? And then I sort of trust my instincts to kind of push on the pieces that are going to result in the most growth, for better or worse. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Hey, can I ask a couple of questions?
Sure. Let's pass it to Dan Miller, another regular who we're really happy to hear from again, who's also just a heavy hitter in the space of climate tech and organizing resources for incredible climate solutions. Go ahead, Dan. What's your question?
I'm also one of the early investors in Algae back in like 2005. So, so I know the space a little bit. But so tell me, I didn't hear the whole thing, so I'm sorry about that. But maybe you could just tell me what you think the total per year CO2 sequestration would be, and what the total possible is, like the cumulative. And then how do you handle the problem of the fact that when algae grows, the first thing it does is block the light from hitting the rest of the algae? So are you using photo bioreactors and things like that, or what's
I'll probably be able to
apologize since I missed a lot.
Yeah, I'll probably be able to answer that question in 6 months to a year. But I mean, I have ideas, but it really depends on the mechanics of the system. There are, because you can imagine a system with, say, 2 tubs that moves water from one to the other, and then the algae from one is scraped out by a mechanism. I mean, just to be clear, like kind of the thing I'm imagining is the Roomba of algae, right? Like kind of like a really dumb thing that just like slurps stuff off the floor and puts it in a bag kind of thing. Like, so, there will be some sort of like pump and filtration system, and there'll be presumably some rate at which you can like extract algae from the solution into a compartment where it could be sort of like compressed or stored, that is optimal relative to the need for it to reproduce in the solution and the sort of underlying chemistry of the system. So I'm imagining at first it's a matter of like drain the water out and scrape it out with a spoon, and then you get like more and more sophisticated after that. Because you kind of, I guess, would, ideally you would like a system that works like a production line, right? Where like once a day, an algae brick kind of shits out the side of it, that's sort of the...
Are you sequestering in the deep ocean or someplace else?
No, I'm sequestering in local landfill because in 2022, California will put into action a regulation that says every district in California will be required to store household green waste with zero emissions storage. So they're taking care of the getting rid of it.
This is not going to work, by the way. You're not even. I just can't imagine. The scale is really kind of unbelievable. I mean, the amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere weighs more than all life on Earth.
Oh, sorry. Let me be really clear about one point because I've done the scaling thing a couple of times, and I don't want to sound totally naive. Every time you solve a scaling problem, it unlocks the next level of the next scaling problem, right? But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean you can avoid going through that point. So, what I'm talking about at this point is like a very like Kickstarter-y like home kit that's like going to make no dent whatsoever in like global CO2 emissions. However, as we grow, we will begin to reach, hopefully what you do is you get these good growth problems, right? Where you begin to reach the limits of like what a system can actually take. But as long as you retain the optionality to bypass those, then you sort of deal with those problems as they arise. So like, yeah, am I treating like the actual like, storage and like sequestration of this as an externality? Like, yes, at this point. That doesn't mean it won't become part of the methodology as time goes by. But we're not, anyway, it's nowhere near being a problem.
I got to say goodbye now because I'm going to be in the cell area just in a moment. So anyway, good luck.
Oh, sure. I appreciate the question. Thanks.
Thank you for jumping in, Dan. Let's pass it to Hazel if you have a question. I know you've been up here on the stage since the start. I'm not sure if you actually had a question for Dan. Feel free to turn your microphone on if you do.
Hi, Hazel. I think she might be working on like how to make things glow, like plants. She might be busy. Last time I talked to her. Thanks, Arin.
Okay, Wesley, let's hear from you then. Go ahead.
Oh, I just enjoy these rooms. Pull to refresh and small steps, giant leaps. You guys make my brain better, I think. But yeah, just hanging out, listening. Congrats.
Thanks, Wesley. Okay, great. Let's pass it to Dylan. Go ahead.
Hey, everyone. It's very interesting to see the title of this room. My thoughts, I guess, are more general in regards to I thought it was interesting seeing the algae kits in regards to the XPRIZE, and I'm curious to hear the thoughts of this room on the value you see XPRIZE holding for these types of technologies, in the sense that I feel like a lot of the things that ended up get funding through these things aren't actually valuable in any real way. It's to go to say things like, I don't see things like algae being talked about very often in carbon sequestration things on the bigger scale.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Can you give an example of something that didn't get funded that should have, and something that did get funded that shouldn't? Just so I can contextualize your comment.
Yeah, it's a bigger. I mean, what was the Elon Musk came in, right? And they did the funding that went to the cement, right? The cement for the silos.
Mm-hmm.
That funding didn't come from Elon Musk. It came from another organization.
That was the NRG COSIA. There's two oil companies that funded a different Carbon XPRIZE that just ended.
Cool.
But we know what you're talking about, and that is definitely something to critique. Yeah, so that's your example, right?
Yeah. One example, and the fact that things like algae or things like soil remediation and bioremediation and things like that aren't talked about very often in these kinds of conversations, it seems.
Well, you should come to more of our rooms because we talk about that stuff all the time.
Sweet.
Yeah, you're just not in the right rooms.
Okay.
I think I hear what you're saying though, and I do think it's important to be aware of like economics and power in this situation and how, it can create outcomes that seem unfair. Like personally, like being part of the XPRIZE has already been worth it to me because it's compelled me to actually take action when before I wouldn't have. And if I don't win it, I'll still have taken that action. So like, I'm not at the point yet where I care how fair it is. But broadly speaking, I think that there's probably a lot of vested interests who like the Boeings and Lockheeds and Exxons and whatever of the world who would love to, use their existing connections with government to kind of get, almost ransom money to save the planet, right? I just think, that may or may not happen. I don't really have a say in whether or not that happens, but I do have a say in whether or not there's an alternative, because I can work on that. I've done a lot of work in politics. I actually built this system called Nation Builder that's like used by most of the political parties in most democracies in the world, or even pseudo democracies. So I'm familiar with like the how I suppose the economics of politics work, right? Like what kinds of things go into political parties and what kinds of things come out as a result. There's plenty of room to be cynical, but there's also plenty of room to realize that like there's a bit of realpolitik that happens around some of these things. And, things can turn on a dime under the right conditions. They really can turn on a dime. Like there is nothing is hard coded in the future of politics. And you absolutely have to remain optimistic enough to keep working on the problem, because you never know how fast things can suddenly change when the shit hits the fan.
And wow, so that adds some context too with Nation Builder. Because, we're not just talking to some like kind of person with middle of the night harebrained schemes. Like you have done a lot of things. You've created a lot of successful systems. So if you're taking a system design approach.
You know who Nation Builder's biggest customer was?
Who's that?
Donald Trump. Anyway, let's move on.
Yeah, I don't know if you should volunteer that information.
No,
so
I didn't. Nobody tell anyone.
So, but what's amazing though is just that that instead of sitting around worrying about this problem, you're taking action and applying a very different type of thinking. Just the way that it's so like kind of how you bootstrap software oriented. So that kind of segues into the next question I kind of brought up earlier that I was hoping you could talk about, which is how do you see this rolling out? There's so many open source projects. I imagine, Raspberry Pi, where it's like, well, this is open source hardware, you can get a hold of it, but also, somebody's got to manufacture it and somebody's getting paid to make it. And there's a sort of business model there. And we've seen Raspberry Pi computers evolve to become very capable machines through this kind of a model. So I'm wondering, because that seems so clearly baked into your idea that you're going to do something that has no reason to not be, to not be able to at least get started. And it has no reason to not be able to get to the next level of buy-in. In a way, it sounds like your main angle is like, hey, I think there's a market for being able to do something proactive, even if it's small, if it's reasonably user-friendly, and educational for the participants. Like that's the main thing I'm hearing in your pitch.
Yeah. Like, yeah, the first pass, the idea I find exciting and the one that I can relate to is parents like me that want something they can do for their kids, and maybe they can afford $100 and they can buy it, and maybe they can put a kit together that has semi-complex instructions. You saw a lot of that in the pandemic, like because so many people are educating their kids at home. They're like, shit, what can I do to give my kids an education? And a lot of people taking the opportunity to do sort of maker faire type stuff, like 3D printing and all sorts of microfabrication stuff. And so this is sort of like in that spirit. But at the same time, I have thoughts about what would happen after that. Like every time you kind of get to a point, you're really just unlocking the next set of problems. And I don't want to really be like too focused on that. Like, there is that Muskian sort of saying it's like make reversible decisions quickly. Like, momentum sort of trumps most other concerns. And so that's the spirit in which I'm trying to evolve. But like, I do live in a town that has a history of large scale PCB manufacturing for high-end video systems. I live in Grass Valley. It's the Grass Valley Group, right? Is sort of famous for that. And so they've got like all of these like now idle like factory and warehouse space, like in the middle of town, with like 1,000 parking spaces, like gathering dust, and like all of these like loading docks and stuff. This also an area that's famous for like growing marijuana. And we've got huge amounts of like hydroponics and like permaculture and organic farming and stuff like in this specific area. And so like right on my doorstep, I have this like huge set of expertise and resources. And like there are people here in town who are making like serious inroads, sequestering carbon in soil using microbes and like getting paid by the California government to do it. And so like, I have my eye on all of those things as sort of opportunities to sort of tap into the infrastructure and expertise here and maybe even make this town like famous for a new thing, right? It was a gold mining town, and then it was a high-end video and video game town, and maybe it'll be a carbon capture town.
Right. And now Dan jumped off, but that kind of is an answer to his question. Although he was asking, he's a real numbers guy. And he actually, you should tell him in 6 months when you have the answer to his question, you should definitely get in hold of him and tell him, because he does actually invest in these kinds of things.
Yeah.
If the point though that I'm hearing is that there's no reason that this couldn't scale to the full demand that would exist worldwide for such a kit. And the other thing that seems to be between the lines is that the data that would be accumulated, the machine learning that could be gleaned from such a user base is actually where the real value is held.
Look, what you're scaling is the data and the idea, right? There's nothing you're scaling other than that, because the end user hardware will evolve, will change, will be manufactured differently over time. Like if you're successful, right? Like, the margins on modern, like on the Model Y or whatever, like have changed totally over time. The way it's manufactured is completely different, because as they've blown through different like scaling issues, they've had to come up with different ways of like making stuff, right? To reduce their dependency on external suppliers and, to increase throughput and remove bottlenecks and mistakes and whatever, right? Like how this, so really it's about the idea. Like does the approach scale? Not like, does any one particular thing that we're doing today, like, have a limit? Because you start by throwing the algae in the friggin' green waste bin, right? And like, is that going to scale to like 25 tons of algae a week or something? Like, no. But it gets you started. And then, you got to figure out that other stuff as you go. But like, we've got to capture it somehow, right? Like, you can say, well, we don't have the infrastructure to pick up algae from everyone's house. It's like, well, we never used to have sewers and electric lines and like garbage trucks and like all these other things. And like along the way, there was a need for them. And so we did it. I don't see those as unsolvable problems, right?
Well, the other thing I like is just turning the disposal question into just like a extended compost idea. Like, we want to do that too. Why don't we just actually, instead of just making sure that everyone's composting, which is actually very significant too,
right?
In terms of the carbon footprint that causes. But in addition to that, let's actually have in people's homes some extra growth happening of some kind.
Right.
But, it brings up a few other questions. Like, I mean, these are maybe like for later type questions, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this, which would be, a couple things. One is the material science of what you make these drums out of, being that there is a carbon footprint to the creation of,
we don't
materials.
Make the drums. We don't make the drums. like only make the smallest possible amount of material. And so like, this is a really important aspect to the scalability properties question. Like, this is supposed to go in, it can go in your pond, it can go in a bathtub that you drag out of your house or whatever. It can go in a food grade. I bought these drums for $20 each, right? Secondhand.
Right. So it uses reclaimed containers or it can,
absolutely. Absolutely. Like I'm trying to make this thing out of like, it's so jerry rigged. It's such a fucking science project looking thing, but like all recycled stuff, right? Like Tupperware containers, because every single piece you have to manufacture is more committed emissions. And that's just more time the thing has to run just to recover the cost of its own production. Like, fuck that, right? Like you don't want to have like the first year just be like recapturing the carbon emitted by building the system that captures carbon because you've screwed yourself, right? That's never going to scale. It has to start capturing from zero, right?
You don't want to be at a deficit.
Right. You don't want to be like, if it's, again, it's like about this sort of capital efficiency sort of thing. It's like if you're competing to be the place where someone puts $1 to capture carbon, you can't be saying like, well, it's a carbon deficit for like a year or two, and then it's net like captured, right?
It's like you don't want to graduate from college in a huge amount of debt.
Yeah, like that leaves you in a situation that I call the like no good choices solution, right? Where it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. This is a thing where, like, I say often to people who are uncomfortable with some of the solutions about climate change, was like, we can't fill the atmosphere with like sulfur. Like, that's a terrible idea. It's like, maybe we've got only bad choices left, and we're going to only have worse choices the longer we wait. So like, maybe that's the least bad choice.
Well, that's where Bill Gates's mind is.
Yeah. Like, maybe he's right.
And so the other part of that question though is, have you thought forward? Let's say you have all this optimized data that can really jump into any body, and in that body be like, here, my sensors are turned on. Oh, I know what I need to do. I need to do more of this. Have you thought about a form factor that could be the industrialized version of this? Is that something you've spent time on, or are you really taking this one step at a time?
I haven't spent time on that. There's nothing about this that can't scale up like that. Like, it's just not at all what I'm thinking about.
There are potential. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think as you approach larger and larger scales, you get into totally different economics about the best way to structure the system. I think.
Right.
Like,
variables change.
If you're building a single vertically integrated thing that's like the size of the Gigafactory, you would not use a bunch of Raspberry Pis, right? Like, you would build that in a completely different way with like massive subsystems and huge ducting and like insane like amounts of electricity coming in, running giant pumps and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, if you were scaling up vertically in one place, you probably end up like using a different kind of algae because all the numbers would work out different. So actually,
I'd like to make a point on that because the history of microalgae cultivation is littered with a bunch of dead bodies of those who had something work out really great bench scale. But as they tried to scale it up to larger photobioreactors, things just didn't scale conveniently. Like the Reynolds numbers changed, and aeration changed, and obstacle depths changed, and they didn't get the results that they got on the bench scale when they had the pilot scale.
Right.
And so actually, there may I suspect that there will definitely be something to scaling, not via the classical chemical engineering scaling approach, but rather by having many copies of an optimal but in itself individually smaller sized photobioreactor.
Yeah. My dad used to build and run factories, and I've seen kind of the how different that is, right, in terms of the conditions and the things that you're optimizing for versus like a little hobbyist scale thing. And I'm not excited or like in solving those problems just yet. That's like way beyond what one person can accomplish by themselves. I'm just literally looking to see if I can do this for myself and give other people enough information to copy what I've done. And like, maybe, like I was actually saying to my friend today, who was working more on the marketing and movement building side of this, maybe what this is ultimately does is gives people something that they can do in their own homes to feel like they're learning about or doing something about climate change. And maybe that gives them the sense that solutions are possible, and then they have the political will to demand that from their government. Because at the end of the day, capitalism isn't actually going to solve this problem. Like, it's a tool, it's a part of the problem. But like all these things where people have said, well, I can make algae and then turn it into sneakers, or I can make algae and sell it as cosmetics. It's like you're limiting it to the size of that market. And so maybe, ultimately, I think this is a thing where big institutions are going to want to like pour money in the top. And maybe what this is about is actually more the political will and giving people a sense of hope side than the actual like final gigantic like planet-wide climate change solution.
Well, and when you frame it that way, it almost sounds like some kind of culture hacker move, especially when you talk about it as a project that you could do with your kids. And also, we're all really excited here about this emerging industry of carbon removal and companies voluntarily paying. No governments are making them. Stripe and Shopify, other companies are pre-buying tons, sometimes from operations that are not even off the page. They're just in an idea form to go do things like, maybe sprinkle some nutrients in a forest to try to get the forest to have more, embodied carbon. And, companies amazingly are actually supporting new stuff. And we all have the feeling of like, this is about to be an airplane that's going to take off. You talked about the runways that you worked on earlier. So we have the feeling, and yet it may turn out that the reality is that your kids, when they're adults, finally the actual industry that can really remove enough carbon from the air to make a meaningful impact finally has the will of the people and the eventual collective realization that it just has to happen, and there's no debating or arguing. And if it turned out that they got there because of what they worked on with your dad, with their dad, like that would be also a beautiful outcome.
I feel like, I should mention something really, really powerful I learned. I actually studied under Al Gore on the Climate Project and was a volunteer presenter of the Climate Project back in the day, right after The Inconvenient Truth came out. And we were in a big like Q&A with him, and everyone was saying, well, you've come out and said we should aim for 350 parts per million, but like, these esteemed scientists are saying that we should aim for 320 parts per million. And this is back before we'd even reached 400. Right. And now what are we at? 420? I don't know. But he said, yes, absolutely. We have to get back to 320. But if you look at the history of changes we've made like this, and you can look at things like CFCs, right. And stuff like that, where an industry had to change the polluting thing that they were using to some other polluting thing. He said, you have to create a target that's achievable enough that you can get a plurality of stakeholders behind it and like build the political movement behind it, because it doesn't seem like a pipe dream you're never going to get to. And then once you have that momentum, once things are moving in a certain direction, they actually tend to tip exponentially under the right conditions. So like suddenly you've got people, it's like Moore's law, right? Like you've got people looking 18 months, 2 years out and starting to say, well, I need to plan for that reality. And therefore, I'm going to capitalize on, the opportunity that presents. More and more money is being spent on carbon credits. And there's this mechanism for me to, produce them right in my house or in the ocean or whatever it is. And so, I'm going to start investing in that ahead of time because we can all see where this is going. And so then you actually end up blowing past the target. So it's like the target doesn't matter as long as it's directionally correct, and then you can course correct over time once everyone's aligned in the right direction. That's like that's like my reading of it anyway, like naively perhaps.
No, that's beautiful. Dan jumped back in the room. Dan, it seems like you came back to have like some kind of last word. What do you have for us, Dan? If you're listening, if you're not on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I was thinking of putting algae in landfills. I think that will increase global warming tremendously.
Oh, sorry.
If you do that.
These are landfills that don't release methane.
No, they don't release methane much. You only need like 1% leakage rate to totally offset any sequestration you're doing and increase global warming by a hell of a lot.
Yeah. Well, so Dan, so what do you think about the California initiative that Dan talked about?
Well, he's talking about that initiative, and so I think the people who are storing that and releasing that methane would be in a lot of trouble, because I believe the spirit of the law is that we're supposed to be capturing all of that, the climate causing changing gases.
So Dan Miller, you must have looked at this initiative. Do you know what Dan Walmsley is talking about?
Well, in general, I didn't hear a specific thing, but if you're going to make algae,
right,
and then you want to put it in landfills, that's not the
okay. So
you need to have permanent, 100-year sequestration, which means putting it, either turning it into rock. Well, algae. Let's see if it's algae. If it's algae, you got to put it at the bottom of the ocean, which is really hard to do because all the fish want to eat it. So that's part of the problem. And algae is cool because it's half of all the biomass on Earth, which is kind of an amazing thing. But and you can't, and making it in super high scale is hard, because if you have an algae bloom, the first thing it does is block the light from hitting the algae below. And the only way you can get around that is you have a photo bioreactor, which makes the thing way too expensive, insanely expensive. So it's hard.
Yeah. So just I'm just reading. I don't know. I found a news article about this briefly, but basically the entire intention of the California regulation is to eliminate greenhouse emissions from green waste. So
that's the intention.
I don't know this. I don't know how they specifically implement that. I mean, interestingly, my uncle actually built a lot of
groundbreaking space missions.
What is that? It's just playing a video on that thing. My uncle actually was involved in creating landfill-based power generators in India for a long time. So I'm sort of familiar with how much methane they can produce. And I was hopeful with this regulation, given the intent that it would be truly zero emissions. And if it's not, that's something that they need help with. It's not a problem that I am currently trying to solve, but presumably it is a problem that will be faced by any system that needs to sequester carbon. It will need to find a way to compress it into a format that can be buried.
Ways. You either put it underground back where it came from. It was there for 100 million years. So we know that you can turn it into rock or biochar, which are stable forms of carbon that don't go back into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But one thing you can't do is just put it in a landfill. We're talking about having at least 100, but better 1,000 to 10,000 year sequestration.
Yeah.
And even if it leaks 1% a year, that's no good, because it's all back in the atmosphere in 100 years, right? So it's really hard.
I'm certain that it's hard. It's and I'm hopeful that there's somewhere out there, there's a conversation happening with somebody who feels that their calling is to concentrate on that part of the problem.
Well, there is a solution that's been talked about that people question, and that is, if you can get the algae to sink to the bottom of the ocean, it'll be there for 1,000 years. That's pretty good, and you can do it with fertilization, but people have found that it doesn't work that well.
Yeah, that was my original XPRIZE, was actually an ocean-bound robot that essentially grows algae and then pushes it below 100 meters in the ocean, which effectively sequesters it for 100 years.
Well, 1,000 meters, just to make sure that quote. I think you're misquoting 1,000 meters.
Okay, 1,000.
So little appreciated point about stuff that grows in the ocean. At least cyanobacteria, and I believe also some other phytoplankton, though I really should double check that, also produce methane. So the question would be how much of that makes it back to the surface as opposed to being metabolized by other things in the ocean. Yeah. But I don't think that it's something that we can ignore if we're doing things at huge scales.
Yeah, but these things are also relative to each other, right? Yes, there may be some leakage rate or attrition rate of sequestered carbon back into the atmosphere. But that, as long as you're sequestering at a sufficiently high rate, like pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, faster than it's going back in and scaling that up, that at least gets you to a place where you're helping the planet more than harming it. And now maybe you're creating a ticking time bomb, right? Because you've got these places where you've put all this stuff and it's gradually leaking out. You've still improved the situation pretty substantially because you know where all those emissions are going to come from, and you can deal with that problem in one location rather than having to face the problem of sucking all that shit out of the atmosphere, which is, I think, the harder part.
And that's the part that you're focused on. And also that's the part that this project as you've described it and as it can be executed, which is really the important thing. Like, we can all come in and say, yeah, but what about this? What about that? The point is that you're using the tools that you have, and that's kind of what XPRIZE is causing. I mean, even on that day, the other day when you gave your little XPRIZE pitch, the other teams that pitched, they were equally focused around the skills and talents that they happen to have already. Right. Yeah. So it's like this crowdsourcing approach is supposed to do that. Right. And actually, not a single team is really ultimately tasked with solving this problem. What we're all doing is participating in the collective discovery of a solution. I mean, that's the way I view it. I know it's competition. We are supposed to have winners, but...
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not even focused on the prize, really. I'm focused on being part of the community. Because I figure at some point I'll probably just kind of, if there's another team that looks like it's doing well, I'll just join them, right? So to take nothing away from how much I believe in this idea. But the point you make is important. What I'm doing and the way I'm doing it, in my mind, takes nothing away from any of those other approaches. They're just not things that I could do. I'm not an academic, and I'm not, a biologist, and I'm not this and I'm not that. But I have these skills, and so I can take this approach, and it's something that can scale down to the level of a single person, because these are pieces of information I have in my own head, or things I can learn, over time. Yes, I think it's very important to turn, especially when you're middle-aged like me. I'm about to turn 44. I have to turn everything into a problem I've solved before. Like that's how I feel like I have agency in the situation. Like, I know this, I know that, I know this, I know that, and there's an unknown, and there's an unknown, and there's a, independent variable or whatever. I do believe that everybody should take that approach, because that allows you to have some confidence as you move forwards that you've got a handle on things. And so I'm trying to do what it takes for me to sort of remain, unblocked. Like, what are the things I can do today? And then what are the things I need to prepare for in the future? And so it's such an early stage of the journey. I almost feel like silly saying, talking about large scale anything, right? Because all that stuff's just a dream. And I'm just trying to make sure it's a dream that could come true. Yeah.
It's beautiful. I love how you're using the refined instrument that you yourself have become, rather than try to be something that you're not. With that approach, I believe probably anyone out there could work on something that makes a contribution to this grand challenge that we all face, within whatever their niche is. And if we keep having these conversations, keep sharing these ideas, I think we'll eventually get there. So thank you so much, Dan, for taking the time. Dan Walmsley, everybody. Blink your microphones to show your applause.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me on. If you want, I don't even have a freaking website yet, but email dan@gravityrail.org if you have more questions or want to connect or anything. I'm going to be blogging eventually at gravityrail.org. I've started a Tumblr because I work at Tumblr, gravityrail.tumblr.com. So that's me. And I really appreciate being part of the conversation and the thoughtful questions. And I'm really looking forward to getting to know you all better over time.
And I'm looking forward to getting a kit, and I want my nieces and nephews to have one as well. Don't let any of us say stop you, Dan. Make the kit. Make an awesome crowdfunding campaign. Get it in the hands of a whole bunch of people. That will have undoubtedly that will have a positive impact. And who knows? There may be other ways to see different teams collaborate and industrialize various aspects of the stuff we've talked about today. So can't wait to see what the future holds. Thank everybody for listening in.
Thanks for listening to the Pull to Refresh podcast. Please remember to leave a review in Apple Podcasts and check out our website, pulltorefresh.team, where you can follow the technology and solutions we are developing.